The Whisper of Shadows. The mansion loomed over the city like a forgotten relic, its grandeur veiled by time and secrets. Perched atop a hill, the estate of Elias Montag, a once powerful tycoon now confined to his bed, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a revelation that would never come. Or so everyone thought. Nurse Clara Marshall adjusted her uniform as she stepped out of the cab, her gaze climbing the sprawling facade of Montag Manor. The wrought iron gates had opened grudgingly after her identification was verified, and now the estate's silence pressed against her like an invisible hand. She hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag. A job was a job, she reminded herself, and after the month she'd had, this position was a lifeline. The grand oak door creaked open, revealing an older woman with sharp features and a colder demeanor. Dressed in a pristine navy dress and pearls that seemed to constrict her throat, she regarded Clara with an expression that could wither roses. "Miss Marshall," the woman said briskly, "I am Mrs. Alice Whittaker, the estate manager. Follow me. The patient's care must not be delayed." Clara nodded, stepping into the vast, marble-floored foyer. The air smelled of lemon polish and something faintly medicinal. Paintings of stern ancestors glared down from gilded frames, their eyes following her every step. Despite the house's elegance, there was a heaviness here, a weight that Clara felt settle in her chest. "This way," Alice instructed, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Clara followed, her mind replaying the details of her assignment. Elias Montag had been in a vegetative state for nearly 2 years following a sudden collapse. His family, fractured and feuding, had retreated from the public eye. Clara's task was simple on paper: provide round-the-clock care for Mr. Montag, ensuring his basic needs were met. The promise of a generous salary had sealed the deal, though Clara now wondered what hidden costs might accompany such wealth. They passed through narrow corridors and staircases that twisted like secrets. Finally, Alice stopped in front of a door carved with intricate patterns of ivy and roses. "This is Mr. Montag's room," Alice said, her voice tight. "You are to follow the instructions precisely. No deviations. Understood?" Clara bristled at the tone but nodded. "Of course." Alice's eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of defiance. "Good." She opened the door and gestured Clara inside. The room was a strange blend of luxury and medical necessity. Heavy drapes dimmed the sunlight, and antique furniture stood as sentinels around the bed where Elias Montag lay. Monitors hummed softly, their lights blinking in rhythm with the frail man's shallow breaths. His once imposing frame was now gaunt, his face etched with the kind of lines that told stories no one dared to speak aloud. Clara approached cautiously, her professional instincts taking over. She adjusted the IV line, checked his pulse, and noted his temperature, all within normal limits. Yet as she moved around him, she couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself was watching her. "Everything satisfactory." Alice's voice broke the silence, startling Clara. "Yes," Clara replied, glancing back. Alice stood in the doorway, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. "Good," Alice said. "Remember, this household values discretion above all else. Do your job, and you will be compensated handsomely. But cross any boundaries." She let the sentence hang in the air, her meaning clear. Clara forced a polite smile. "Understood." Alice lingered a moment longer, her gaze sharp as a blade, before finally retreating. The door clicked shut behind her, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Alone now, she turned her attention back to Mr. Montag. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling with the aid of machines. Yet there was something about him, an energy, faint but undeniable, that unsettled her. Leaning closer, Clara studied his face, searching for signs of awareness. "Mr. Montag," she said softly, though she didn't expect a response. "If you can hear me, I'm here to help." For a moment, there was nothing but the steady hum of the monitors. Then, just as Clara began to turn away, something extraordinary happened. His eyelids flickered, and his lips parted ever so slightly. A faint, dry whisper escaped, too quiet to understand, but unmistakably deliberate. Clara froze, her pulse quickening. Had she imagined it? She leaned in closer. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Again, his lips moved, but no sound came this time. Still, the flicker of awareness in his expression was enough to send Clara's mind racing. Was he truly as vegetative as the medical reports claimed? Or was there something, or someone, keeping him this way? She stepped back, shaken but determined. If Elias Montague was trying to communicate, it was her duty to find out why. Yet even as she resolved to dig deeper, the weight of Alice's warning pressed on her mind. Discretion above all else. Clara glanced toward the locked cabinet in the corner of the room. It seemed out of place amidst the otherwise seamless blend of luxury and care. Could it hold answers? Her fingers itched to investigate, but the sound of approaching footsteps sent her heart into her throat. She turned just as Alice re-entered, her gaze immediately narrowing. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Clara lied smoothly, "just getting familiar with the equipment." Alice nodded but didn't look convinced. "Dinner will be served in an hour. Be sure to attend. Mr. Montague requires no further care until morning." Clara nodded, watching as Alice's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before leaving again. Alone once more, Clara turned back to Elias. His eyes remained closed, his breathing steady, but the whisper lingered in her mind like a ghost. What was he trying to tell her? And why did she feel as though the entire house was conspiring to keep her from finding out? Shadows behind the curtain. Dinner in the Montague manor was an affair that reflected the household's rigid control and eerie stillness. The long dining table, set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses, was more suited to hosting grand banquets than feeding the few remaining inhabitants. Clara sat at one end, a modest plate of roast chicken and vegetables before her. Across the table sat Alice Whittaker, poised like a vulture surveying a carcass, her sharp eyes flicking between Clara and the empty spaces where family members should have been. No one else joined them. "You'll find the staff here keep to themselves," Alice said, breaking the silence. She sliced her food with military precision, not meeting Clara's gaze. "There's no need for unnecessary chatter." "I see," Clara replied, keeping her tone neutral. The silence stretched as she chewed her food, her thoughts wandering back to Elias Montague's room. The flicker of life she'd seen in his eyes earlier had been impossible to dismiss. Was it a fleeting reflex, or had he truly tried to communicate? As if sensing her distraction, Alice's voice cut through Clara's thoughts. "How are you settling in, Miss Marshall? Is everything to your satisfaction?" "Yes," Clara said quickly. "The household is very organized." Alice gave a tight smile. "We value order here. Mr. Montague's condition requires nothing less." There was an edge to her words that made Clara uneasy. She wondered if Alice had noticed her lingering by the locked cabinet earlier, or had somehow guessed that Clara's curiosity was already stirring. She decided it was best to tread carefully. Alice placed her fork down and leaned forward slightly. "I assume you've read the medical report provided. There's no need to concern yourself with speculations about Mr. Montague's condition. The doctors have been very clear. He's in a persistent vegetative state. Your job is simply to ensure he's comfortable." Clara nodded, but a knot tightened in her stomach. The implication was clear. Do your job, don't ask questions. She gave a polite smile and excused herself as soon as she could, retreating to the upper floors where the weight of Alice's presence didn't feel as oppressive. The corridor outside Elias's room was dark and quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a grandfather clock at the end of the hall. Clara paused by the door, her hand hovering over the knob. The cabinet she'd noticed earlier tugged at her thoughts, a magnet for her curiosity. If Elias had indeed tried to communicate, perhaps whatever was inside that cabinet would explain why. She glanced up and down the hall, ensuring no one was nearby, then stepped inside. The room was just as she had left it, though the atmosphere felt heavier. as though the shadows had deepened in her absence. Elias lay motionless, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the monitors. Clara approached the bed, leaning down to check his pulse. It was steady, but as her hand brushed his wrist, she felt a slight twitch. Her breath caught. "Mr. Montague," she whispered, "can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered briefly, and his fingers twitched again, this time more deliberately. Clara leaned closer, her heart pounding. "If you're trying to tell me something, move your hand again." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, his index finger curled inward, pointing faintly toward the locked cabinet in the corner. Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced back at the door, half expecting Alice to burst in. But the hallway remained silent. Turning back to Elias, she whispered, "I'll find out what you're trying to say. I promise." The cabinet was solid mahogany, its lock a small but sturdy brass fixture. Clara tugged at the handles to no avail. She knelt, examining the lock more closely. It was old-fashioned but sturdy, and without a key, there was no chance of opening it quietly. Frustration gnawed at her, but she knew better than to force it. If Alice or anyone else discovered her tampering, she'd be out of the house before she could gather any answers. Instead, Clara returned to the bedside and sat in the chair, her thoughts spinning. What could be so important in that cabinet? And why did Elias seem so desperate to direct her toward it? As she sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of the house pressed on her again. The silence wasn't just silence. It was oppressive, as though the walls themselves held secrets too heavy to bear. Clara's eyes wandered to the room's corners, where shadows pooled like ink. A strange sensation crept over her, a feeling of being watched, though she was certain she was alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Clara froze, her breath catching. For a moment, she considered pretending she hadn't heard it, but the knock came again, more insistent. She rose, smoothing her uniform, and opened the door. Standing in the dim hallway was a young woman with wide, anxious eyes and a bundle of linens clutched to her chest. "Miss Marshall," the maid whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "May I speak with you?" Clara frowned. She recognized the girl, Felicia, one of the housemaids who always seemed to avoid eye contact and move as quietly as a shadow. "Of course," Clara said, stepping aside. "Come in." Felicia hesitated, her eyes darting down the hall again before she slipped inside. She stood near the door, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. I need to warn you." "Warn me?" Clara asked, her curiosity piqued. Felicia nodded, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Whittaker, she's watching you. She doesn't trust new people, especially not nurses. The last one didn't last long." Clara's stomach dropped. What happened to the last nurse? Felicia shook her head. "I don't know. She left suddenly, without her things. Just be careful. Mrs. Whittaker doesn't like questions, and she doesn't like anyone getting close to Mr. Montague." Clara leaned against the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Why doesn't she want anyone getting close to him? "Do you know?" Felicia hesitated, her hands trembling. "I don't know much," she admitted. "But there's something wrong in this house. Mr. Montague, he wasn't always like this. He was strong, sharp. Then, one day, he just collapsed. And after that, everything changed. Mrs. Whittaker took over, and no one asks questions anymore." Clara studied the young woman, her fear and sincerity evident. "Felicia, if you know anything at all, it could help." The maid shook her head quickly. "I can't. I've already said too much. If Mrs. Whittaker finds out I've spoken to you." Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Felicia clutched the linens tighter, edging toward the door. "Just be careful," she whispered again before slipping out. Clara stared at the closed door, her mind buzzing. Felicia's warning only confirmed what Clara had already suspected. There was more to Elias Montague's condition than met the eye. Whatever had happened to him, Alice Whittaker was at the center of it. Returning to the chair by the bed, Clara sank into the cushions, her resolve hardening. Elias Montague wasn't just a patient. He was a victim, trapped in a body that betrayed him. And if he was trying to communicate, it was her duty to listen. She reached out and touched his hand gently. "I'm going to figure this out," she whispered. "I don't know what's in that cabinet, but I'll find a way to open it." For the briefest moment, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of gratitude in his expression, or perhaps it was just her imagination. The night deepened, and the house fell into an uneasy silence. Clara sat by the bed, the weight of her promise heavy on her shoulders. Somewhere in the shadows of Montague Manor, the truth was waiting to be uncovered, and Clara was determined to find it. The Keeper of Secrets. The following morning brought a veil of routine over the Montague Manor, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the polished surface, the house was seething with secrets. The mansion's corridors seemed darker, the air heavier with unspoken truths. As she adjusted Mr. Montague's feeding tube, the events of the night before replayed in her mind, the desperate twitch of his hand, Felicia's cryptic warning, and the locked cabinet that beckoned with answers just out of reach. Her instincts told her that time was running out. Mrs. Whittaker's shadow loomed large over the house, and every interaction with her made Clara feel like she was being assessed, catalogued, and prepared for disposal. A sudden revelation. Later that afternoon, Clara noticed something odd while reviewing Mr. Montague's chart in the nurse's alcove. The prescribed medication list seemed standard, but as she traced her finger down the list, her eyes caught a discrepancy. A drug labeled resveratrol was marked as administered daily, yet Clara hadn't seen it among the vials in the medicine cabinet the night before. Instead, there were the strange, unlabeled vials filled with a pale yellow liquid. She grabbed a notepad and scribbled down the details: the dosage, the supposed purpose of the medication, and the absence of any official labels. Was this the key to Mr. Montague's unusual state? Was someone substituting his prescribed medications with something else entirely? Clara's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe. She turned to see James, the groundskeeper, standing awkwardly in the doorway. His wiry frame and weathered face spoke of years spent tending to the sprawling gardens, but his eyes carried an alertness that suggested he noticed far more than he let on. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, masking her surprise. James hesitated, glancing down the hall before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I heard you were asking questions," he said, his voice low. "About Mr. Montague." Clara's pulse quickened. "What do you know?" James rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting to the closed door. "Not much, but enough to know this house ain't right. I've worked here 20 years, and I've never seen it like this. Ever since Mr. Montague fell ill, Mrs. Whittaker's been running things like a military camp. Staff come and go, and no one asks why." Clara leaned forward. "Do you know what's in the locked cabinet in Mr. Montague's room?" James shook his head. "No, but I've seen her go in there before. Late at night, when everyone else is asleep. She carries a small key on a chain around her neck." Clara frowned. If the cabinet required a key and Whittaker kept it with her, then breaking into it would be nearly impossible without risking discovery. She would have to find another way. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. James shifted uncomfortably. "Because you're different. You don't look away like the others. You've seen him. You know he's not just gone. He's still in there." His words felt like a lifeline. For the first time, Clara realized she wasn't completely alone in this house. Someone else saw the same cracks she did. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice steady. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this." James gave a quick nod and left as quietly as he'd come. The search for the key. That evening, Clara decided to act. If Mrs. Whittaker was the gatekeeper of the secrets in Montague Manor, then she needed to find a way to access that key. The idea made her stomach churn. Snooping through someone's personal belongings was a line she'd never crossed before. But this was no ordinary situation. Elias Montague's life depended on it. She began by observing Mrs. Whittaker during the evening routine. As the house staff moved about their duties, Clara noticed how Mrs. Whittaker kept her movements tightly controlled, her presence commanding obedience wherever she went. The small gold chain around her neck glinted faintly under the chandelier light. Clara caught a glimpse of the key itself, no bigger than her thumb, tucked discreetly beneath the high collar of Whittaker's dress. Clara's opportunity came when Whittaker excused herself to her office, a room she used as her personal command center. The door was always closed, but Clara had noticed earlier that it didn't have a lock. She waited for Whittaker to step inside, and then positioned herself down the hall, pretending to check a supply list in the alcove. After nearly 20 minutes, Whittaker emerged and strode purposefully down the corridor. The key still hung around her neck, but Clara noticed something else. The office door remained ajar. Her heart pounded as she slipped toward the room. Pushing the door open carefully, she stepped inside, her senses immediately assaulted by the scent of lavender polish and paper. The room was immaculate, every paper stacked, every pen aligned. On the desk, Clara spotted a small leather-bound journal. She opened it quickly, scanning the pages. A journal of lies. The journal contained notes written in Whittaker's neat, precise handwriting. Most of it was mundane, staff schedules, delivery dates, but a few entries stood out. One in particular made Clara's blood run cold. July 12. Adjusted Mr. Montague's evening dose. Increased sedation per instruction. Must ensure compliance with estate plans. She turned the page, her eyes narrowing as she read further. July 19. Isabella must remain uninvolved. Lawyer arrives next week. Presentation must be flawless. No disruptions. The name Isabella appeared several times, always in connection to Mr. Montague. Who was Isabella, and why was Whittaker so determined to keep her away? Clara quickly photographed the entries with her phone before returning the journal to its original spot. She left the office as quietly as she'd entered, her mind racing. Whittaker was manipulating Mr. Montague's condition. Of that, there was no doubt. But why? And who was this Isabella, clearly a threat to Whittaker's plans? The whispers return. That night, Clara returned to Elias's room, her resolve stronger than ever. She sat beside him, her voice soft as she spoke. "I found something today," she said. "Your medication is being tampered with, and there's someone named Isabella. Someone Whittaker doesn't want near you. Who is she? Can you tell me?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, just as Clara was beginning to doubt herself, Elias's hand twitched faintly. She leaned closer, her heart racing. "Isabella," she repeated. "Is she your family? Someone important?" His lips moved, but the sound was faint, almost inaudible. Clara held her breath, straining to hear. "Daughter." The word came out as a whisper, barely louder than the hiss of the oxygen machine. Clara's heart clenched. Isabella was his daughter. A new wave of determination surged through her. She had to find Isabella. If Whittaker was keeping her away, it was for a reason. She squeezed Elias's hand gently. "I'll find her," she promised. "I'll bring her back." Elias's lips moved again, forming another word. This time, it was clearer, though still faint. "Danger." Clara sat back, her pulse thundering in her ears. Danger, for Isabella, for her, or for both of them. A glimmer of hope. The next day, Clara made her way to the servants' quarters, hoping to find Felicia. If anyone knew more about Isabella, it would be her. But when Clara arrived, she found the small room empty, the bed neatly made. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach as she spotted a folded note on the nightstand. It was addressed to her. Clara unfolded it with trembling hands and read the hastily scrawled message. "Miss Marshall, I've been dismissed. Mrs. Whittaker knows I spoke to you. Be careful. She won't stop until she controls everything. Find Isabella. She's the key. Felicia." The note felt like a lifeline and a warning all at once. Whittaker's reach was longer than Clara had imagined, but Felicia's parting words confirmed what she'd suspected. Isabella was the answer. Clara tucked the note into her pocket, her resolve hardening. She didn't know how she would find Isabella or what it would take to stop Whittaker, but one thing was clear. She was in the middle of something far bigger than she had anticipated. And there was no turning back. The edge of deception. The dismissal of Felicia sent a cold wave of fear through Clara, but it also brought clarity. Whittaker's control was slipping. If the housekeeper had taken such drastic steps, it meant Clara was closer to something than she realized. The name Isabella echoed in her mind, heavy with meaning and urgency. Whoever this woman was, she was the thread that could unravel Whittaker's web of lies. A glimpse of the truth. That evening, Clara began her shift with a heightened awareness of her surroundings. The mansion felt different, its silence more oppressive, its shadows longer. She had grown accustomed to the sounds of the house, the faint hum of electricity, the creak of old wood settling. But now there were new noises, distant murmurs, footsteps that stopped abruptly when she turned. Someone was watching her. As she entered Mr. Montague's room, the sensation of being observed intensified. She looked over her shoulder, but found the corridor empty. Taking a steadying breath, she closed the door behind her and turned to the bed. "Mr. Montague," she whispered, approaching him. "I need your help. I know Isabella is your daughter, but I need to understand what's happening here. Can you tell me anything more?" His eyelids fluttered, and his hand twitched faintly. Clara leaned closer, her pulse quickening. For a moment, his lips moved, but no sound came. Then his hand made the faintest gesture toward the cabinet. The cabinet again. Clara bit her lip, frustration bubbling inside her. She had no way to access it without the key Whittaker wore like a talisman. But Montague's insistence couldn't be ignored. Whatever was inside that cabinet held the answers he wanted her to find. "I'll find a way," she promised him softly. The lawyer's arrival. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with unusual activity. Staff members scrubbed floors and polished surfaces with a fervor Clara hadn't seen before. Even the guards stationed at the gates seemed more alert, their sharp eyes scanning every movement. Over breakfast, Whittaker offered an explanation, her tone clipped and formal. "The estate lawyer will be arriving tomorrow to review Mr. Montague's affairs. I trust you'll ensure the patient is presented in an appropriate manner." Clara nodded, hiding the spike of anxiety that Whittaker's words triggered. The lawyer's visit felt like the culmination of whatever scheme was unfolding within these walls. Clara needed answers before he arrived. Answers she could use to expose Whittaker's deceit, a hidden ally. That afternoon, Clara ventured to the garden, ostensibly to clear her head. She found James near the greenhouse, tending to a row of hydrangeas. He straightened as she approached, his expression cautious. "Miss Marshall," he greeted, wiping his hands on a rag. "You look troubled." Clara hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Do you know anything about Isabella?" she asked in a low voice. James froze, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you ask?" "She's Mr. Montague's daughter, isn't she?" Clara pressed. "I think Mrs. Whittaker is keeping her away for a reason." James's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the house. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Marshall." "I don't have a choice," Clara replied. "Mr. Montague is trying to communicate with me. He wants me to find her." For a long moment, James said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he gestured for Clara to follow him. They entered the greenhouse, where the humid air and dense foliage created a semblance of privacy. "I worked for Mr. Montague when Isabella was still a child," James began. "She was his pride and joy, bright, kind, full of life. But when her mother passed, things changed. Mr. Montague buried himself in his work, and Isabella grew distant. By the time she was an adult, they hardly spoke." "What happened between them?" Clara asked. James hesitated. "Isabella made choices her father didn't approve of. She married someone he didn't trust, a man named Victor Hale. That's when things fell apart." Clara frowned. "And now?" Now I think Whittaker is using their estrangement to her advantage. She's been blocking Isabella from seeing her father, probably feeding the old man lies to keep him docile. She has the guards on her side and enough influence to make sure the staff stay silent. Clara's heart sank. Do you know where Isabella is? James shook his head. No, but I know someone who might. There's a woman named Evelyn who used to work here as Mr. Montague's secretary. She left shortly after he fell ill. If anyone knows the truth, it's her. Where can I find her? Clara asked urgently. She runs a small bookstore in the city. The Turning Page, James said. But be careful. If Whittaker gets wind of this, she'll stop you. A risky journey. That evening, Clara waited until the mansion was quiet before slipping out through a side entrance. She had borrowed a staff member's coat to blend in and made her way to the gates, where she flagged down a passing cab. The bookstore was a modest, brick front shop nestled between two taller buildings. Its sign hung slightly askew, and the display windows showcased shelves lined with well-worn books. Clara entered, the bell above the door chiming softly. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked up as Clara approached, her expression curious. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "Are you Evelyn?" Clara inquired. The woman's expression darkened slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Clara Marshall. I'm a nurse at Montague Manor." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "I don't work there anymore." "I know," Clara said gently, "but I think you can help me. It's about Mr. Montague and his daughter." At the mention of Isabella, Evelyn stiffened. She glanced toward the windows as if ensuring no one was watching, then gestured for Clara to follow her to a back room. The room was cramped but cozy, with stacks of books lining every surface. Evelyn closed the door behind them and folded her arms. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Clara said. "I think Mr. Montague is being manipulated, and Isabella is the key to stopping it. But I don't know how to find her." Evelyn sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I tried to help him when it started. When Elias first fell ill, I suspected foul play. But Whittaker shut me out. She fired me when I started asking questions." "Do you know where Isabella is?" Clara pressed. "I do," Evelyn admitted. "She's in Florence, managing an art gallery. But it won't be easy to contact her. Whittaker monitors all communications coming in and out of the estate." Clara's mind raced. What about a direct line? A phone number? Evelyn hesitated, then moved to a small filing cabinet. She pulled out an address book and flipped through its pages before scribbling something on a scrap of paper. "This is her number," she said, handing it to Clara. "But you have to be careful. Whittaker won't let you go without a fight." Clara took the paper, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you." "Good luck," Evelyn said. "You'll need it. The call that changes everything." Back at the mansion, Clara returned to her room and locked the door. She retrieved an old prepaid phone from her bag, something she had brought as a precaution. Her hand shook as she dialed the number Evelyn had given her. The phone rang twice before a soft, hesitant voice answered. "Hello. Is this Isabella Montague?" Clara asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Clara Marshall. I'm a nurse caring for your father. I think he needs your help." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice laced with both hope and fear, Isabella said, "Tell me everything." "The web begins to unravel." Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. The fragile connection with Isabella Montague felt like holding onto a lifeline in a storm. The silence on the other end stretched before Isabella's voice came again, steady but strained. "Tell me everything," Isabella repeated. Clara took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Your father isn't in the vegetative state they're claiming. He's trying to communicate, small movements, faint whispers. But someone is keeping him sedated. I've seen the medications being used, and they don't match the official records." "Who?" Isabella's voice was sharper now, tinged with urgency. "Mrs. Whittaker," Clara replied. "She runs the household and controls everything. I think she's keeping you away on purpose. There are journal entries where she explicitly mentions you as a threat." A bitter laugh escaped Isabella. "I'm not surprised. Alice Whittaker has been after control of the estate for years. I didn't realize she'd stoop this low." Clara frowned. "Why? What does she gain from keeping you out of the picture?" There was a pause. Then Isabella spoke, her voice colder now. "My father changed his will a few years ago. If something happens to him, the estate defaults to a trust. Whittaker is listed as one of the trustees, but only if I'm out of the picture. She must think she can manipulate the trust for her own benefit." The pieces clicked together in Clara's mind. "She's blocking you to maintain control. But your father, he's trying to tell me something. I think he wants you to come back." "I want to," Isabella said firmly, "but she's done everything in her power to isolate me. The last time I tried to visit, her lawyers threatened me with trespassing charges. I didn't know how bad it was until now." Clara hesitated. "I can't do this alone. If you're willing to come, I'll help you. But we have to move fast. The estate lawyer is arriving tomorrow, and I think Whittaker plans to finalize something." "I'll come," Isabella said without hesitation. "But I'll need time to arrange a flight. How can I contact you?" Clara glanced around her small room, anxiety gnawing at her. "I have a prepaid phone, but it's not secure. Once you land, call me, and I'll find a way to meet you." "Understood," Isabella replied. "Be careful, Clara. If Whittaker finds out you're helping me—" "I know," Clara interrupted. "Just get here as soon as you can." The call ended, leaving Clara staring at the phone. She had taken a step she couldn't undo, aligning herself fully against Whittaker. The stakes had risen, and the battle for Elias Montague's freedom was now a matter of survival. A brewing storm. The following day dawned gray and cold, mirroring the tension in the air. Clara moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, her every movement shadowed by the weight of what was to come. Whittaker's demeanor seemed more brittle than usual, her commands sharper, her gaze lingering longer on Clara, as if sensing her defiance. By mid-morning, the estate lawyer, Mr. Harold Finch, arrived. He was a thin, sharp-eyed man with a briefcase that seemed an extension of his hand. Clara watched from the alcove as Whittaker greeted him with an overly polished smile, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Mr. Finch, it's always a pleasure to see you," she said, leading him into the study. The door clicked shut behind them, and Clara's stomach churned. Whatever they were discussing, it couldn't be good. She needed to act soon, but the arrival of the lawyer complicated things. With Whittaker on high alert, her every move would be scrutinized. The locked cabinet. That afternoon, while Whittaker and Finch remained ensconced in the study, Clara returned to Mr. Montague's room. The locked cabinet loomed in the corner like a sentinel guarding its secrets. Clara approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. She didn't have the key, but she did have a makeshift plan. From her pocket, she pulled a thin strip of metal, a hairpin she had bent into a crude lockpick. It wasn't a skill she had practiced often, but desperation drove her. Kneeling before the cabinet, she inserted the pin into the lock, her hands trembling as she worked. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The lock resisted, and Clara's frustration mounted. Just as she was about to give up, there was a faint click. The cabinet door creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside were folders, thick and bound with rubber bands. Clara grabbed the first one and opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. Financial records, medical charts, and what appeared to be personal letters. One document caught her attention, a detailed breakdown of Elias Montague's medication regimen. Scribbled in the margins were notes in Whittaker's handwriting, suggesting adjustments to dosages. Another folder contained correspondence between Whittaker and Victor Hale, Isabella's estranged husband. Clara's stomach tightened as she read the letters. Whittaker had been working with Victor to keep Isabella distracted, feeding him funds from the estate in exchange for his cooperation. At the bottom of the cabinet was a photograph, tucked into an envelope. Clara pulled it out carefully. It was a picture of Elias and Isabella, taken years ago. They stood in front of the mansion, smiling warmly at each other. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, was a single line: "For Isabella, my everything." Clara's throat tightened. This was the proof she needed. Evidence of Whittaker's deception, and a glimpse of the bond between Elias and Isabella. She gathered the documents and carefully locked the cabinet again, ensuring there was no sign of tampering. A dangerous confrontation. As Clara returned to the alcove, clutching the documents, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she found herself face to face with Whittaker. The older woman's expression was ice cold, her eyes narrowing as they swept over Clara. "You've been very busy, Nurse Marshall," Whittaker said, her voice dangerously calm. Clara's heart pounded. "I don't know what you mean." Whittaker stepped closer, her posture rigid with barely concealed anger. "You're not as clever as you think. Do you really believe I don't know what you've been doing? Snooping through records, talking to the staff, meddling where you don't belong." "I'm just doing my job," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Whittaker's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Your job is to follow orders, not ask questions. I've tolerated your insolence long enough. Perhaps it's time we reconsidered your position here." Clara gripped the folder tighter, her resolve hardening. "Mr. Montague deserves better than this. He's not as unaware as you think." Whittaker's smile faltered, replaced by a glint of something darker in her eyes. "Be very careful, Miss Marshall. You don't know who you're dealing with." With that, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Clara watched her go, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and defiance. Whittaker's warning was clear, but Clara couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to exposing the truth. The plan. That evening, Clara retreated to her room, her mind racing. She spread the documents across her desk, piecing together the story they told. The financial irregularities, the manipulated medications, the correspondence with Victor. It all painted a damning picture of Whittaker's scheme. But she needed more. She needed Isabella. Clara dialed Isabella's number again, her hands trembling. The phone rang 3 times before Isabella answered. "I'm on my way," Isabella said without preamble. "I'll be there by morning." Clara's relief was palpable. "Good. I've found evidence. Documents that prove what Whittaker's been doing. But she knows I'm onto her. You'll need to be careful." "I will," Isabella promised. "When I arrive, we'll confront her together." As the call ended, Clara felt a surge of determination. Morning would bring a reckoning to Montague Manor, and Clara was ready to stand beside Isabella to ensure justice was served. But the night was long, and the shadows in the mansion seemed darker than ever. Whittaker wouldn't give up her control easily, and Clara knew the battle was far from over. The final reckoning. The night passed slowly, tension thick in the air. Clara barely slept, her mind cycling through every possible scenario. The documents she had uncovered were damning, but would they be enough? Whittaker was cunning, and her control over the mansion was nearly absolute. Isabella's arrival was the catalyst Clara needed, but the risk was immense. When dawn finally broke, Clara was already dressed and waiting. The estate lawyer, Harold Finch, was still in the study, likely reviewing documents Whittaker had carefully curated to present her version of events. The household staff moved quietly, as if sensing the storm brewing. Whittaker was nowhere to be seen, but Clara knew she was preparing her next move. A reunion in shadows. Isabella Montague arrived just after 8 a.m. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her sharp green eyes scanned the front steps with a mixture of defiance and hesitation. Clara met her at the side gate, leading her into the mansion through a servant's entrance. Isabella was dressed plainly, but her presence radiated authority, a quiet, contained power that contrasted sharply with Whittaker's manufactured dominance. "Clara," Isabella said, gripping the nurse's hand. "Thank you for calling me." For believing in my father. Clara nodded, her voice low. We don't have much time. Whittaker knows I've been digging, and the estate lawyer is already here. She's probably trying to finalize control of the trust. Isabella's jaw tightened. Then we'll stop her. Together, they slipped through the quiet corridors toward Elias Montague's room. Isabella's steps faltered when she saw her father for the first time in years, lying pale and frail against the crisp white sheets. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't know it was this bad, she whispered, her voice breaking. Clara placed a reassuring hand on Isabella's shoulder. He's still here. He's been trying to communicate with me, trying to reach you. Isabella stepped closer, taking her father's hand in hers. Dad, she said softly. It's Isabella. I'm here. For a moment, there was no response. Then, to Clara's astonishment, Elias's eyes fluttered open. His lips moved faintly, and a whisper escaped. Isabella. Isabella gasped, clutching his hand tighter. I'm here, Dad. I'm going to fix this. Elias's hand twitched weakly, his fingers brushing against Isabella's. The moment was interrupted by the sharp click of heels in the hallway. Clara froze, her pulse racing. Whittaker, she whispered. The confrontation. Whittaker entered the room like a storm, her expression a mask of fury barely held in check. Behind her, Harold Finch followed, his briefcase clutched tightly. What is the meaning of this? Whittaker demanded, her voice ice-cold. Her eyes darted to Isabella, narrowing with contempt. You have no right to be here. I have every right, Isabella shot back, her voice firm. He's my father. Whittaker's smile was a venomous thing. Your father appointed me to oversee his care. You forfeited your right to involvement years ago. I think the evidence will prove otherwise. Clara interjected, stepping forward. She held up the folder of documents she had retrieved from the cabinet. These papers show exactly what you've been doing. Manipulating Mr. Montague's condition, embezzling funds, and working with Victor Hale to isolate Isabella. Whittaker's composure cracked for the first time, her face tightening with barely concealed rage. Those are private records, she snapped. You have no authority to access them. Neither do you, Isabella said, stepping closer. And once the courts see this, they'll strip you of every shred of control you think you have. Finch, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. If these allegations are true, Mrs. Whittaker, they are highly irregular. This could jeopardize your role as trustee. Whittaker's gaze darted between Finch and the documents in Clara's hands. You have no proof, she hissed. Nothing that will hold up in court. I wouldn't be so sure, Clara said. She pulled out the journal she had photographed, flipping to the entries where Whittaker documented altering Elias's medication and conspiring with Victor Hale. This journal outlines everything. And your handwriting matches the notes on these financial documents. Whittaker's face turned ashen, but she recovered quickly, her voice a hiss. You think you can walk in here and destroy everything I've built. I've protected this estate for years, kept it from falling apart. You've protected nothing, Isabella countered, her voice rising. You've exploited my father's illness for your own gain. And now it's over. A twist of fate. As the confrontation escalated, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Whittaker, her back against the wall, turned to Finch, her voice pleading now. You've known me for years, Harold. You know I would never do anything to harm Elias. Finch frowned, his gaze darting between Whittaker, Isabella, and Clara. Mrs. Whittaker, these are serious accusations. If there's any truth to them, I'm obligated to report this to the board. Whittaker's composure shattered. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice rising. This woman abandoned her father. She has no idea what's best for him. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. Mr. Montague is aware, and he's been trying to tell us the truth. His condition is not what you've claimed it to be, and you've been keeping him sedated to maintain control. Isabella knelt beside her father, her voice trembling. Dad, is it true? Did she do this to you? Elias's lips moved again, forming a single hoarse word, yes. Whittaker's face twisted in fury. This is a farce, she spat. He doesn't know what he's saying. But it was too late. Finch's expression had hardened. I'll need to examine these documents, he said, taking the folder from Clara. And I'll be contacting the board immediately. Whittaker lunged forward, but Isabella blocked her path, her voice sharp. You're done, Alice. Get out of this house. Whittaker hesitated, her hands trembling as the weight of her defeat settled over her. She turned on her heel and stormed out, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Justice and healing. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Finch called the Board of Trustees, who ordered an immediate investigation into Whittaker's conduct. The guards stationed at the estate, previously loyal to Whittaker, were dismissed, and the staff finally began to relax, their fear dissipating. Elias Montague's care was transferred to a new medical team, one chosen by Isabella. Clara stayed by his side as the sedatives were tapered off, her heart swelling with hope as his awareness slowly returned. By evening, Isabella sat with Clara in the drawing room, a fire crackling in the hearth. I can't thank you enough, Isabella said, her voice filled with emotion. You gave me my father back. Clara smiled. Exhaustion etched into her face. He gave himself back. I just listened. The door opened, and James entered, carrying a tray of tea. He placed it on the table with a quiet smile. It's good to see this house alive again, he said. Clara nodded, her heart finally at ease. The shadows that had clung to Montague Manor were lifting, replaced by a new sense of hope. And though the journey had been harrowing, Clara knew she had done what was right. Epilogue. Months later, Elias Montague sat in a wheelchair, his strength slowly returning under Isabella's care. Clara visited often, her bond with the family unshakable. Whittaker faced charges for fraud and elder abuse, her schemes unraveling under the weight of the evidence. As Clara stood in the garden one sunny afternoon, watching Isabella and Elias share a quiet laugh, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had stepped into a house filled with darkness and deceit, but together they had brought light back to Montague Manor. For the first time in years, the estate felt like a home again.